Welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast. This is the NFL edition. We are back with our second podcast of the year in the preseason for this 2017 season. We are going to talk another interesting podcast. We did team win totals last week with Ed Fang, and this week we're going to discuss some player props. We're going to talk awards and then just some silly fun props as well. As usual, I am joined by some fellow Labbers, Matthew Freedman, editor-in-chief of Labs, Peter Jennings, a.k.a. Ram, co-founder of FantasyLabs. And this week, another special guest, friend of the pod, though. He's been on several times with us, Chris Raybon, who is a senior DFS editor at 4for4, also hosts his own podcast, which is great, DFSMVP pod with TJ Hernandez, another friend of the pod. Chris, thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm happy to be back talking some football with you, Matthew and Peter.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I'm sure we'll have you on to discuss some regular, week stuff during the season with DFS. But definitely excited to talk some projections and props for the preseason and the whole season. So I wanted to start, Chris, because I know that you do a lot of projections, both for season long and DFS. So I just wanted to give you a quick minute to talk about your process of creating projections, whether you start with a baseline algorithm and whether you tweak those for season long and for DFS, and just the difficulty of projections in NFL. Just want to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit, introduce yourself.
Most definitely. I think when you start with projections, what you want to do first is you want to start on the team level and then kind of build in. So you don't want to just start projecting players before you really know exactly what their usage is going to be, or everything's not going to line up. So what I usually do is I'll take a team level baseline. You can do that a number of ways. I'll usually just for a basic projection, I'll start with just last year's team level rushing attempts, passing attempts, and then I'll apply a regression, and that's just to account for how much a team's attempts change from one year to the next. After I do that, what I'll do is I'll make adjustments for game script. So there'll be regression in that as well. For example, a team like the Dallas Cowboys they were leading more than all but the two Super Bowl teams last year. They ran more plays when leading. So this year, Vegas expects them to win 3.5 fewer games. So you have to make even a further adjustment and probably add some pass attempts to their projection because they're not going to be able to just run the ball all the time. So after I do that, then from there, I'll kind of distribute the volume to each player using market share data. You can use past data. And of course, there'll be some, manual adjustments just depending on how I feel about a certain player or how much of the workload I think he'll get. So once the volume is there and the volume has been distributed, at that point, that's when I'll start to apply individual player efficiency. And that, as you alluded to, is difficult sometimes because there's a lot of fluctuation from one year to the next in a lot of efficiency stats. We know yards per carry is not very stable. We saw a guy like Thomas Rawls go from leading the league down to barely over 3 yards a carry. Things like yards per target, yards per pass attempts. Quarterbacks are a little more stable from year to year. But after I apply those, then the final step is going to be to adjust for injuries because every position has a different injury rate. Running backs tend to get injured a lot more, or not a lot more, but definitely more than other positions. So you want to kind of adjust for that. On a season-long level, I usually knock a running back about 2 games off, whereas every other position I project about 1 missed game. And then there'll be certain players where I'll adjust that further, but not too much because my actual co-host on the podcast, TJ Hernandez, did research that found that games played really have no correlation from one year to the next, except for tight ends. And it's just really small for tight ends, about 0.20. So there's not going to be that much correlation between injuries unless a player has had a lot of injuries. And I really think it's a problem, then I'll ding them more games. But that's how I do the season long. And then for in season, I'll kind of take those season long projections and create divide that by how many games I project them to play to get a points per game baseline or a per game baseline for each stat. And then I'll just adjust those based on, now you're going to look at the matchup and you're going to look at the Vegas lines for touchdowns. I think is very helpful because there's a direct correlation between implied point total from the Vegas lines to the amount of touchdowns a team scores. So I'll usually distribute touchdowns by kind of like with the same market share principle. And then there's home road splits are another thing where we see quarterbacks play better at home. Tight ends tend to score a lot more of their touchdowns at home. So sometimes on the road, I'll take some off a tight end and give some more to the wide receivers in terms of touchdowns, even if the overall team projection is going down. And things like that you just want to pay attention to, especially with receivers, where the ball is going to go. Is it a funnel defense? Is that going to affect the target market share? Is it going to affect efficiency? And things like that. So the season long is really just kind of taking the in season is really just taking the season long and dividing it into points per game and then adjusting from there.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you going through that. Matt, we do our own projections at Labs. But I mean, it's interesting. Projections are always tough, like in NBA DFS, for example, or just NBA in general. Projections are super important and pretty stable just because of the minutes that a player gets per game. And you're right, it is sort of like opportunity based. Like that's how important projections are. We know golf and baseball projections aren't really that useful. Matt, what are your thoughts on projections? And like, are you more, do you put more weight in season long projections just because the stability of the 16 games is easier to project a guy over 16 games than it is to project him just for one, as ironic as that may sound?
Yeah, I agree. And one quick thing to add on to this, Chris contributed a chapter to a book that was recently published at Roto World talking about projections. And obviously that book was put together by Jonathan Bales. And out of all of the chapters in that book, that's the one that I've revisited multiple times. Chris has some great stuff in there. But yeah, going to the question about projections, I tend to use the seasonal projections as the baseline from which I try not to deviate too much. I think it's really easy throughout like the heat of any given week to look at a matchup and say like, oh, this wide receiver is going to be matched up against this crappy cornerback. I have to jack up his projection. And there are several like assumptions there that might not be safe. Like we don't even know how many snaps in the game he's actually going to be lining up across from that cornerback. There are just a lot of things that I think are like on a week-to-week basis, you should make some adjustments, but I think they should be much smaller than most people normally do. I mean, honestly, like I like to project. I know this sounds crazy, but like even thinking about NFL draft prospects, I like to think on like a multi-year basis. I know that's unreasonable, but that's kind of my starting point for thinking about some of these guys. Like, someone like Mike Evans entering the league. What type of production could you hope to get from a guy like this over his first 3 or 4 years, like over his rookie contract, and then make adjustments from there?
Yeah, I think I actually did some research on this, and it varies a lot between positions. So, for example, a running back's fantasy points in his last game can tell you more about what he'll do in his next game than a season's worth of sample size for a quarterback or a receiver. So it really depends on the sample size. And then there's different stats that project fantasy points even within a season. So, for example, a lot of people talk about targets with wide receivers, and targets are the ultimate basis for projecting wide receivers. And I honestly used to think that myself, but when I did more research, what I found was that targets are only projecting fantasy points in the next game for wide receivers up to about 4 or 5 games. After that, fantasy points themselves are the best predictor, and that's because there's just so much of a variation for wide receivers in terms of targets. There's so many different target distances. Then there's wide receivers who get red zone targets, wide receivers that don't. So after about a handful of games, that statistical profile of a wide receiver is going to start to come together, where you're going to see the wide receivers that are getting deeper targets or more red zone targets start outscoring the wide receivers that might get a few more targets overall, but they're not as high value of a target, or their quarterback is bad. For example, we saw that last year with guys like Allen Robinson and DeAndre Hopkins. They were near the top of the league in targets, but struggled to finish even as wide receiver threes because the quality of those targets was just paled in comparison to some other wide receivers.
Yeah.
Just to add something really quick to what Chris said there, I think Tyreek is like the poster child for that trend of looking at past production instead of targets. Like, I think with all of that, you see that Tyreek is actually a pretty talented player, even though he wasn't getting the targets.
Interesting. Yeah, this is a great conversation. Just to put a bow on this, we'll just look from a sort of a broad view. Pete, one thing that we get asked at Labs is, why don't we provide projections for baseball, and why don't we provide projections for NHL and PGA? It seems like the best bettors, the best DFS players understand projections and sort of the error bars behind them, like just how important they are and when you should rely on them and when you shouldn't. Any last thoughts on the sort of that sort of notion and just the projections talk in general?
Well, it's an event-based. Those are the most event-based sports, baseball and hockey, obviously with goals and home runs. So it's a little bit tougher to nail down a very specific projection. The NBA is obviously the easiest. You can figure out how many minutes someone's going to play, and you're going to have a very narrow range in terms of the outcomes for their points, assists, rebounds, etc. Football is a little bit of a hybrid. The touchdown is obviously a really big event that is a little bit harder to predict, but obviously we can still kind of get a good gauge of guys who are more likely to score touchdowns, guys who are going to have a lot of opportunity to score touchdowns. So I like the conversation you guys are having. I do think it's a lot easier once you get into a season. I think the other part of predicting performance, it's a lot easier to predict how players are going to do once you're saying like week 10, 11, 12. I think that's a lot easier predicting one game than trying to predict the full season a year ahead. But certainly coming into the season from an early standpoint, I get where you guys are going. I think the other big thing in these projections, and we'll get into the props, injuries are a huge thing. And I know Chris hit on that. It's hard to predict injuries. There's a couple things I've seen, like how foot injuries are correlated to hamstring injuries. And there's certain things I think are red flags that you can point to, but it's definitely a tricky business trying to predict injuries.
Awesome. Yeah, great conversation. I think that was really nice to have before we get into these props. But let's jump right in now. So we're going to start with some of these futures just in terms of like most receiving touchdowns, most passing yards, those type of props. And then we'll get into some like specific player props that I've asked these guys to bring to the table, ones that stood out to them, and then we'll finish with some just interesting ones that we found. So we're going to start and run through some of these. And I'll kick to these guys. I've asked them to give me two thoughts on each of these props. The first one being independent of odds, who do you think has the best chance to win? And then their best value or best bet. So it could be the same answer. If the favorite they think has the best odds and is the best bet, then that could be the answer, or they could be two different answers. So we're going to run through these. We're going to start with most regular season receiving touchdowns, which is definitely an interesting category. Looking back to last year, Jordy Nelson, returning to Green Bay, won. He had 14 touchdowns. In second place was three different players. Devontae Adams, also of the Packers, had 12. Antonio Brown and Mike Evans also had 12. Odell Beckham was alone in fifth with 10. Raybon, I'll kick to you first on this one. What are your thoughts on these odds? Antonio Brown is the favorite right now, but he is at plus 550. So there's not, a super overwhelming favorite to win this category. And I'm sure that there's a lot of variance, especially with event-based things like touchdowns.
Right. I think the most likely player to win is Jordy Nelson. If you look at Jordy last season, he won, and there was another Packer in second place, and that's because whereas receiving touchdowns don't necessarily carry over from year to year as much, passing touchdowns do. And the bottom line is that Jordy Nelson is the number one receiver, both overall and in the red zone, for the quarterback most likely to throw the most passing touchdowns. Nelson has 27 touchdowns in his last 32 games, and you have some safety built into betting on Nelson, only because the Packers throw more than any team inside the 5-yard line. They threw 63% of the time last season. That was tops in the NFL. The year before, they ranked number 2. So they're going to get a lot of opportunities inside the 5, and I think Nelson is the best bet in terms of most likely. But the best odds, I would probably go with AJ Green. He's at plus 2,500. He has double-digit touchdowns in 3 of the last 5 seasons, 10 or more targets per game in 3 of the last 5 seasons. So when in doubt, I'm always going to take a guy with kind of that mix of the talent to get into the end zone, whether it's by a fluky string of big plays or just getting targeted in general. And then, you know, he has a track record as well. So I think AJ Green is a guy where, you know, he could get the targets. He could just make plays on limited targets. There's a lot of different ways for him to kind of arrive at, 12, 13, 14 touchdowns, and maybe Jordy or somebody else has a down year and AJ could take that win.
Yeah, good call. There's a lot of sharp people that are definitely on AJ. Freedman, throw your hat in the ring here.
All right. I'm interested in AJ, and I think he does provide value. I think one of the issues is that while he was with Hugh Jackson, and then also Jay Gruden before that, he was getting some red zone targets. With Zampese this last year, he didn't get quite as many red zone targets. So I could see that being an issue, and especially with the addition of Joe Mixon and then the return of Tyler Eifert, it's hard to know if those guys might get a little more action in the red zone that could take away from AJ Green. But I agree with Raybon. I think Jordy Nelson is the guy who is likeliest to lead the league in touchdowns again. He gets the ball just incessantly within the 10-yard line, and then they also throw to him deep sometimes. So I think he has multiple avenues to get double-digit touchdowns again. The guy, there are 2 guys I think are pretty sharp. Both of them are tight ends. Gronk, I know it's crazy to say Gronk, but if he stays healthy, no one has more touchdowns in the league than Gronk since he entered the league, and that's with him missing over 20% of his games. So I think he's a guy who has the capability to do it, and he has the 6th highest implied odds right now at plus 1,200, and then Tyler Eifert all the way down at plus 3,300. I think that if someone on that team is going to be getting red zone targets or targets inside the 10, it's Eifert. And Eifert has already tied for the league lead in touchdowns before, just a couple seasons ago. So I think he has a shot, especially being that cheap.
I like those calls. I think that Jordy Nelson probably is the highest equity play. You guys brought up really good points there. I mean, having Aaron Rodgers at quarterback is great. The guy I like the most in terms of like the favorites is Mike Evans. I think Mike Evans is in store for one of the biggest seasons we've seen from a receiver. I think the Deshaun Jackson acquisition really helps the passing game and is going to take the safety off him. If you look and watch film on basically what Mike Evans was dealing with last year, he was dealing with double and triple coverage at times, especially when they got into the red zone. They would just completely take him out. Now they have more weapons. I think Howard could help as well. He also has the size, and Jonathan Bales has done a lot of research on this, and there's a lot of stuff out there. The highest correlation with touchdowns for receiver is size, and Mike Evans basically has that in spades. So I like Mike Evans at plus 800 relative to Jordy at plus 650. Straight up, I'd take Jordy, but I think it's really close. Odell Beckham's interesting. This injury is a tricky one. He definitely has the ability to take, basically any pass for a touchdown. That's the intriguing thing about him. He also is on a record pace right now for touchdowns. So I think Odell Beckham's an intriguing one, but his health is obviously risky. And then getting into the sleepers here, this is the hot take that you guys will probably hate, but I'm so bullish on Amari Cooper this year.
I knew that was coming. Knew it was coming.
Taking him in every draft. I mean, just in the preseason even, already scored a touchdown, looked phenomenal. He's only 23 years old. Everyone's going to point to the lack of red zone targets. I think that's going to inevitably change. He gained more weight this year. He looks absolutely jacked, still explosive, and I like betting on young guys. So I think Amari Cooper has a real good chance to be the number 1 receiver this year, and at plus 2,500, I'll take that.
Yeah, I mean, you're on brand, Pete, right away. I appreciate that. Let's go to receiving yards. Definitely the same sort of guys up here. T.Y. Hilton was the winner last year. Definitely surprised people. If you had him at low odds, you'd be very happy with a little over 1,400 yards, 1,448. Julio was number 2 at 1,409, and then Odell at 1,367. So definitely the studs dominate this category, even though TY definitely surprised. Antonio has the highest odds here yet again at plus 400. Freedman, I'll start with you on this one. Biggest equity and then best odds.
I love Julio. Over his last half decade, so not counting his rookie year, ever since then, he's averaged over 100 yards per game. That's unbelievable. Sure, that's an NFL record. Last year missed a couple of games and still was number 2 in the league in receiving yardage. I think he's easily the front runner. And that's also kind of assuming that there's some regression for Atlanta and that they might have to throw the ball more than they did. Although they were very efficient passing the ball last year, they were near the bottom of the league in actual pass attempts. So I think that goes even more towards Julio. Given that he is not favored, he's trailing Antonio Brown. I like him again as a guy who could lead, but I think I hate to steal Pete's thunder here, but I think Amari Cooper at 1,800. I like him a lot there. I don't think that he's the touchdown guy, but I think he's the yardage guy. I like him a lot. Out of guys who have had 2 years in the league, he's near the top all time in terms of raw yardage within their first 2 seasons. And I do agree. I think he's going to take a pretty big leap this year, and I think there's going to be some regression for the Raiders. I think they're going to have to throw the ball a little bit more than they probably want to in some tighter games. So I do like Amari Cooper there as a guy who has some good value.
Yeah, that's interesting. Raybon talked about the Packers throwing the ball inside the red zone. The Raiders definitely did last year. Crabtree has been the recipient of most of those. Cooper has definitely had some public issues with getting red zone touches. But Crabtree plus 2,000 to have the most receiving touchdowns. But interesting. Pete, what are your thoughts on this receiving yard prop?
I like it. Julio's the guy that I'm always nervous about with his health. I've been taking Mike Evans over him, which I know seems crazy, but the foot injuries, and he just seems like he's a guy who's always kind of beat up. Obviously, he's an elite athlete in a good system, and I do like that he's playing indoors for half his games, or more than half his games with the division they're in. But I think this is an interesting category. I think there's some flyers here that make a lot of sense. Antonio Brown, to me, is the chalk here. The whole passing game for the Steelers should be excellent this year. The return of Martavis Bryant actually helps Roethlisberger, helps Antonio Brown. So I could see him pretty easily winning this. Obviously at plus 400, that's not great value. I definitely was going to bring up Amari Cooper. The other interesting ones to me are guys like Michael Thomas, Terrell Pryor, some guys in new situations, even Brandon Cooks. Raybon, do you have any opinions on those guys? Because Freedman kind of covered the direction I was going to go.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think Julio should be the front runner. I think even he missed 2 games and he was still second in the league in receiving yards. He missed 23% of the snaps and he still led the league in receiving yards per game. So he just has such ridiculous upside. And I mean, Antonio Brown has gotten lucky with health, but we saw him get knocked out with a concussion and things like that. So he's a smaller guy. I don't think that like the health is such a big issue to tilt it. But as far as the newcomers, I think that's a really good point. I was looking at Pryor and Cooks myself. I think we don't know how efficient Cooks could be. Like he could be more efficient than he even was with Drew Brees, with Tom Brady, and that's what it really takes to win this receiving yards title. You need a lot of targets and you need a high efficiency in terms of yards per target. So I could definitely see Cooks. Another flyer I had my eye on, which is probably going to come out of left field for a lot of people, is Sammy Watkins. He's at plus 5,000. Now, there's been 2 receivers over the last 2 years to average 10.9 yards per target or more, Julio and Sammy Watkins. So, like, let's just say, Sammy Watkins gets lucky with a lot of deep balls, and I think that's a prop that could pay off. But those are really the guys I'd be looking at, kind of in that flyer range.
Plus 5,000. Wow, I like it.
Yeah, one question here. Any thoughts on Martavis Bryant? Like, if it's good for Antonio Brown, it's also good for Martavis Bryant. He is the deep target on that team. Let's say there's maybe a situation where Antonio Brown misses sometimes. Like, it's plus 10,000. Like, I think his odds have to be better than that, given how explosive he is within that offense.
That's true. And one thing I meant to say just off the bat on the show, basically profitable props 99% of them are unders. So all these ones where we're talking about the overs and the big ones to hit, these seem like good value. They're not. Like basically all these prices. I mean, Bovada's pretty soft, but there's very little value in betting any of these over situations. So, but I do think it's really interesting. I like Martavis Bryant. The other guy in that same price is Pierre Garçon, is another newcomer. One thing I'd like to target for guys who are going to rack up a lot of yards or teams that are going to be pretty bad. 49ers could make a leap here, definitely on offense, but I don't expect them to be good. And if they're trailing, a guy like Pierre Garçon could get a lot of garbage time yards and targets too.
Interesting. I like it. yeah, definitely hard to win these, but fun to discuss nonetheless. So we'll keep on trucking here. All right, let's go to the other side of the passing game, talk some quarterbacks. We'll go through passing touchdowns and the passing yards like we did with wide receivers. Let's start with TDs. Just some data from last year. The most touchdowns last year, Aaron Rodgers with 40, Matt Ryan had 38. Drew Brees, 37, and then there was a drop down to Phillip Rivers with 33, Andrew Luck with 31. Tom Brady was down at 28, even though he did miss some time. He is actually the favorite right now at plus 400, and then Aaron Rodgers is right behind him at plus 425. Pete, I'll kick to you to start this one. What are your thoughts on this prop?
Aaron Rodgers all day. I think this is a category where you just go with the chalk. Surprised he's not the favorite over Tom Brady. I know Tom Brady's playing in a really bad division. I know Gronk's healthy right now, but as you've seen, Edelman's already gotten hurt, and a lot of things can happen. And Father Time will catch up with Tom Brady. I don't know when. He could be great for the next 3 years, but if I had a choice right now and my life depended on it, I would definitely take Aaron Rodgers over him. In terms of some more flyer guys, I think Jameis Winston really has a good chance. I talked a lot about Mike Evans. I just like the improvements they made. That division should be really nice to throw in as well. You got a couple games on the road indoors. Tampa Bay, is not going to have as bad a weather as a lot of other places. And I just expect Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota, both those guys from the same class, to really make a big leap this year. And Mariota is another guy right there that I think could do well, especially with the acquisition of Eric Decker, who should be great for him in the red zone. So those are kind of where I'm looking at. I think this is a really intriguing one, but gun to my head, one choice, I'll take Aaron Rodgers all day.
I like it. Raybon, jump in there.
Yeah, I have to agree with Pete there. Aaron Rodgers owns 2 of the top 4 passing TD seasons over the last 3 years. He threw 40 last year. He threw 38 in 2014. And like I said, they pass so much, even when most other teams would run, that Rodgers just has this baked-in kind of floor and ceiling where, if things go right, he could just explode even more than we've ever seen before. And then the best odds, I'm going straight up Mariota, just because he's at plus 33, whereas guys like Winston and plus 1,800 and Carr and Roethlisberger are a little lower. So Mariota, his 5.5% touchdown rate is the 4th highest among quarterbacks over the last 2 years since he came into the league. And, everybody on that, all of his receivers can score touchdowns. Like you have Rashard Matthews, he's 210 pounds, scored 9 touchdowns last season. That was 6th in the league. You have Eric Decker at 215 pounds. He scored 14 touchdowns in his last 18 games with the Jets. And then you have Corey Davis, who, was a monstrous touchdown scorer in college, scored more than a touchdown per game over his last 3 seasons in college. You have Delaney Walker, who's been in the top 7 in touchdowns among tight ends for the last 2 years. So, and the thing about Mariota is their attempt rate of passes in the red zone is only 25th last season. So he could gain from not only his receiving core improving, but from just throwing more in the red zone and throwing more as a whole, because Tennessee's also been one of the most run-heavy teams in the league. So if they just kind of regress to a normal pass-run ratio, Mariota could push for that lead easily.
I love that call. That's for the odds, given that there's a plus 1,500 difference. I like that over Jameis Winston.
Yeah, Mariota, those are really good odds. Freedman, want to throw your hat in the ring here?
Yeah, so I agree with Rodgers over Brady and Brees. I think one thing, and I'm publishing today or tomorrow the Saints preview, fantasy team preview. One thing that I think is a secret risk of the Saints offense is that they could go much run heavier than people think. The last time, so Carmichael, who's the play caller right now, his first year as the offensive coordinator was the year they won the Super Bowl. They were actually a run-heavy team then with 3 running backs that they rotated in and out. It seems like they went out of their way this year to get 2 running backs to supplement Mark Ingram. last year in adjusted line yards. They have the number one offensive line. I don't know if Breeze is going to be throwing the ball quite as much as he has. I mean, the odds are that he will because he always does throw the ball a lot, but maybe he doesn't. And the same thing with Brady. It seems like they've kind of gone out of their way to beef up their ability to run the ball with efficient runners that they've added. So I think out of the guys in the top three, Rodgers is the likeliest. I like Roethlisberger at 1,200. I think they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. And obviously, Le'Veon Bell, he can run for touchdowns, but he can catch for touchdowns too. And they throw the ball all the time there. In the Marcus Mariota vein, I'm going with Russell Wilson at 3,300. I think it's possible that they throw the ball a little bit more. And I don't know. I think I understand the logic for Mariota, but I think I would rather pivot to Wilson as a guy who I think we've seen him be a very good quarterback before.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the Saints potentially being a little more run heavy than normal. And that's going to transition right to most passing yards because Drew Brees is definitely the heaviest favorite, plus 350. He did lead the lead last year in passing yards with 5,208 yards. Matt Ryan at 49.44, and then Kirk Cousins, number 3, at 49.17. But yeah, definitely Breeze definitely has the highest odds to do this yet again. Raybon, I'll kick to you on this one first.
I think that Aaron Rodgers is the most likely this year just because of the weapons he has around him. Unlike Brady, everybody's healthy, and unlike Breeze, as you mentioned, not as much of a threat to go run heavy. I don't think the Patriots were necessarily setting Brady up to go run heavy just because they got all these running backs. I actually think it was the opposite. They replaced a runner in Blunt that predominantly played out of under center formations and wasn't really good in the shotgun with a guy in Mike Gillislee, who, while he's not a great pass catcher, he played most of his snaps out of the shotgun last year. Then you still have Lewis and White, and Rex Burkhead is another guy, can play in the slot, can catch the ball. So I think they actually were the Patriots were setting up to actually go pass heavier. They had one of their highest run play rates last year that they've had in a long time. Part of that was due to Brady missing 4 games, but even when he came back, they weren't quite as pass heavy. I think they wanted to change that because they were so successful. But I think Aaron Rodgers, especially with Brady losing Edelman, Aaron Rodgers has to be viewed as the favorite. And then as far as the best odds, I'm looking at a couple of guys a little further down. One is Ben Roethlisberger. You guys have already alluded to it. Martavis Bryant helps him so much. Roethlisberger, with Martavis, his pace is 5,385 passing yards. And so that could easily win it. And then I'm also looking at a guy, Phillip Rivers, who with Keenan Allen over the last 2 years, his 16-game pace is 5,328 yards. So one of those two guys, I think, is definitely a good bet to win it, especially at plus 1,600 each.
Yeah, I mean, those odds on Rodgers are I mean, he might be the most likely and the best bet at plus 700 for most passing yards is pretty good. Freedman, what are your thoughts on this category?
So I'm a little pessimistic on Rodgers. Not that I don't think he will have the volume, but he's never really been near the top of the league in yardage. For whatever reason, so I guess just to come back to Breeze, I think that, and I'm sort of like having it both ways here. I think the Saints will be run heavier, but it doesn't. Even if they're heavier on the run, I think Breeze can still get his. Going heavier for the run for the Saints means that they're just not top 10 in the league in passing. Maybe they're number 15 or something like that in terms of overall attempts. But even in that 1 year in 2009 when the Saints were fairly run heavy, Breeze was still near the top of the league in passing yardage. So I think it's hard to go against a guy who has, I think in the last 11 years, led the league in yardage passing like 7 of those times. So I think Breeze is probably the guy who's likeliest. In terms of value, I think Phillip Rivers at 1,600 isn't bad. I think they will have to ignore everything I just said. That's wrong. They're going run heavy. Ignore everything I just said. Not Phillip Rivers. I think I'd actually maybe go with Matt Ryan, because I do think that they will have to throw the ball much more than they did last year, and he still has Julio Jones there. I think Austin Hooper will take a step forward, and then obviously the running backs in the backfield catching the ball are still very good. So I could see some value with Ryan at 1,000, but I'm not crazy about anybody outside of Breeze. Like, it's just, I don't see a lot of value.
Interesting. Pete, what are your thoughts here?
Oh, I like Aaron Rodgers here. I understand maybe a little hint of pessimism, Matt, but I'm with Chris here. Look at his weapons, too. I mean, someone like Ty Montgomery is going to be a receiver out of the backfield quite a bit, which is also going to buoy his total a nice bit. They're going to face teams like the Bears twice, who I think are going to be elite versus the run, bad against the pass. You get to play indoors versus the Lions, which is going to be nice. So I like the situation overall for Aaron Rodgers this year. I think the TD equity is a little bit better. I think there's a lot of guys who make sense here. I like the Roethlisberger call. I think Kirk Cousins, I mean, he's basically in another contract year. He's going to be throwing a lot. If the Redskins are not even like average on defense, say a little bit below average, that's going to set up really well in garbage time for him. I like some of the guys I mentioned before. I think Jameis is interesting. I like Roethlisberger. But in terms of just the guy I'd take right now, it's definitely Aaron Rodgers. I think the Breeze, the one I'd love to short, is Drew Brees. Matt, you hit on some good points with the running, and at plus 350 relative to these other prices, I would love to short that price or basically book that price.
Cool. All right, let's move to the last passing one we have, which is sort of a fun one. It's the most regular season interceptions. Blake Bortles, like, just out of the players, is the favorite. Probably no surprise. Well, he's actually tied with Eli Manning with plus 550 odds, but the field is actually plus 275. So the field could be considered the favorite. And of course, they don't have odds on guys like Jay Cutler and stuff like that. So let's see here. Can't remember who went first last time. Freedman. Freedman, I think it's your turn to go first here.
Blake Bortles is tempting, but I don't think he's going to get enough plays.
It's an opportunity-based prop.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah, I think he's going to get benched at some point. I think Eli Manning and Phillip Rivers, like, those guys throw a lot of interceptions consistently over the last few years. So I think they are the favorites over someone like Bortles. Winston, I think, will improve, so I don't think he's going to throw as many interceptions this year. So I think between Manning and Rivers, it's kind of a toss-up. I would expect either one of them to have pretty good chances. But yeah, like the field, I think I'll take the field. Like, I think it could be someone like Cutler, someone that we're not really even think. I mean, Jared Goff potentially, but I just don't see him getting enough opportunities to throw a lot of interceptions. So, I think Manning and Rivers, and then I think I'd probably go with the field.
Yeah, it is. So Phillip Rivers did have the most interceptions last year. I forgot to introduce that with 21. Winston was second place, 18th. Pete, what are your thoughts here? It really is an opportunity-based metric, because if you're throwing a lot of receptions or interceptions, sometimes you could lose your job. So it has to be a quarterback who could throw interceptions but also has a safe job, which is definitely an interesting Venn diagram.
So this is a tough one. I would have a ton of conviction if I knew Andrew Luck was playing, because I think the Colts are going to be so bad on defense. I think they're going to be playing from behind. Andrew Luck definitely has the gunslinger mentality, and he's going to go out there and get a ton of volume when he's healthy. So I would like him in that case. He'd be in spots where he'd have to take a lot of risk, and I think he'd be a pretty nice favorite for this one. Outside of that, I mean, you start looking at these names, it's a little tough. I mean, Carson Wentz, I don't mind because he's still young. I actually think Wentz should have a better season this year. They could throw a good bit. I don't think they're really happy with kind of the running back situation. So I imagine a lot of pressure on Wentz with Darren Sproles in there to throw a lot. And I think he's got a lot of quarterback security too. So it's about finding that guy who's going to basically have a lot of opportunity and the job security to stay in there. So I think he's interesting. Rivers is interesting because of the division he plays in. The Broncos are going to be great at intercepting passes yet again this year. I think that whole division is going to set up really well in terms of defense. That's just very tough to play in. So he'd be one guy that I'd be interested in here, but I don't see any great value in this spot. Blake Bortles being the favorite's interesting, but he's got to have such a short leash. If he starts to build a nice lead, I imagine we'll see Chad Henne. So That's kind of what I think. Chris, you have any sharp ones here, or is this a tough category for you too?
Yeah, I think like both of you guys have said, I think Rivers, being that he led the league 2 of the last 3 years, and then Eli Manning, I mean, being a Giants fan for my whole life, Eli Manning is a guy who will throw interceptions kind of irrespective of what's going on around him. So it's not like, oh, well, he got Brandon Marshall now and he's got Evan Ingram and that will help him throw less interceptions. He just throws these really mind-numbing interceptions. And I saw a little bit of what I thought anyway was physical decline last season. So I think Eli Manning could always have a 20 interception season. If I'm going for some odds, I'd actually probably, and this might surprise you guys, but I'd actually go with Ben Roethlisberger. His interception rate is 2.97% over the last 2 years. That's just 0.2 behind Jameis Winston, who's one of the favorites. And I think, like you guys said, Roethlisberger will throw a lot this year because he's got Martavis back, and he's the kind of quarterback similar to a Rivers and a Manning where he doesn't really mind throwing interceptions. And we know we have those 8 road games where he could really pad that interception lead in those 8 road games, even if he's otherwise, having success. Like, he's a guy that can throw, for 350 yards and still throw a couple picks in a game. So that would be my bet at plus 2,500 if I'm just going with the odds. I think the field is you don't get really good odds with the field. So you know what? I'd like to bet the field for a guy like maybe Cutler or something, but those aren't really great odds for me.
Cool. All right, let's move to – there's only one rushing prop. They don't have rushing TDs, maybe because it's weird. LeGarrette Blount won that title last year. He with 18 rushing touchdowns. So if we're looking at like Bovada, they don't have a rushing TD prop. They do have most rushing yards. Le'Veon Bell is the favorite, tied with David Johnson at plus 300. And Pete, I think it's your turn. I'll kick to you first. Ezekiel Elliott was the winner last year, but as we know, he is going to miss some time at the beginning of this year. So definitely an interesting prop for this year.
Man, this is tough. I mean, David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell are the chalk here, but you're only getting plus 300. I guess I would lean David Johnson over Le'Veon Bell. I'm curious your guys' opinion. Week 1, Le'Veon Bell is interesting. He's obviously hopefully going to show up to camp on September 1st, which is what he's saying, but no off season here for him. I do think he has a lot of incentive to be in shape, but I've seen these scenarios a lot, and there's oftentimes a lot of injuries. So that would be my concern. He does have incentive, but we'll see. I guess I'd lean David Johnson out of those two. I think they're both really bad value. I think that it's very likely someone else will lead the league in rushing. Looking at some names here, I think that there's a couple guys that I like a lot. I think Jordan Howard has a really good chance. I think the Bears are going to be really nice running the football. I actually think they're a pretty good team relatively at the line of scrimmage, which is really important. I actually like the Bears a little bit more than most people coming into the season. I still think they'll be slightly below average, maybe a 6-10 team, but I do think they have a chance to play good defense. I think Jordan Howard should get a lot of opportunities, also young. And then outside of that, if I was taking like a big flyer, I like Dalvin Cook on this one. And I don't see when I was looking at this list earlier, I don't see Hunt on this list either. And if you could get him with like the field or something like that, I could see that coming to fruition. But this is a tricky one. I think this is a tough spot outside of David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell, but their prices are just so low at only plus 300 that I'd have to lean somewhere else.
Yeah, interesting call on Howard. I could see the Bears winning their last 6 games once Trubisky starts. Definitely interesting. Raybon, what are your thoughts on this category?
Yeah, I think the most likely it's bad odds, but I'd probably lean Le'Veon Bell. I don't know him to be a guy that really gets himself in trouble outside. Like he's a guy that will like smoke weed and come out and just still rush for like ridiculous amounts of yardage. So
he's so good.
Right. So, I mean, 4.9 yards per carry to DJ's 4.35 over the last 2 years. I think the O-line is a little better in Pittsburgh. Bell has gotten more attempts per game up to this point. I know Arians does want to increase David Johnson's touches. He said he wants to get him a 30 per game. We'll see if that's true or if that's just coach speak. But I just think Bell is probably the runner of this generation in terms of the talent level. I think he's a better runner than DJ. So I'll lean Bell there, but bad odds. My pick, if I was just going straight off odds, would be Todd Gurley. at plus 2,000. I think that the Rams have improved their offensive line significantly. We saw that a little bit in the preseason. We've already seen Gurley's upside even on a Jeff Fisher coach team, even with a bad offensive line. In 2015, Gurley had about 5 games where he was over 125 rushing yards. And I think this season, I think no one's going to touch Gurley in terms of the volume he's going to get. I think he can easily get over 20 carries per game. And I think we might be getting a little bit of a discount just because of the recency bias last year in such a bad situation. So I'd go Gurley for the plus 2,000 odds.
Freedman, finish it up for us.
Yeah, so as they've said, Le'Veon Bell seems to be the guy who's likeliest, but there are a couple of guys, I think, in the Todd Gurley vein that I like almost as much as Le'Veon Bell, and one of them is Melvin Gordon. I think he's going to be getting a lot of run with the Chargers. Anthony Lynn, the head coach there, was the running backs coach under Rex Ryan for the ground and pound Jets, and then with the Bills. With the Bills over the last 2 years, they were number 1 in rushing attempts. Top 2 in rushing yards. Melvin Gordon hasn't been an efficient runner to this point, but I think we should expect some regression. I think he's probably better as a runner than he's looked in terms of efficiency. And if he's getting that volume, and I do believe he is going to get a lot of volume as he did last year, I think maybe even more this year, I think he's going to be a guy with some potential there. And then Jay Ajayi, I think they're going to run him a lot. I think he's also pretty talented. I could see him finishing in the top 4, maybe top 3 in terms of overall rushing attempts. And I think that gives him a shot to finish with the title.
One thing about Gordon is kind of like a counterpoint to his volume is in the offseason, the coaches did say they want to scale him back a little bit in his workload. And one thing to keep in mind is Anthony Lynn, as much as they ran the ball in Buffalo last year, Anthony Lynn gave, when he coached the team in Buffalo or when he's the OC, he gave LaShawn McCoy 60% of the team's running back carries. Now, Gordon got 80% of the Chargers carries last year. So even though the Chargers may want to run the ball, that doesn't necessarily mean that all those carries will go to Gordon, because they explicitly said, like, hey, we might want to scale back a little bit because he did get hurt at the end of last season.
That's a fair point. One thing to talk about just a little bit with Lynn's history is that when he's had, and I think it's maybe a different situation with McCoy because McCoy's older, Gordon is, like in his prime. When Lynn has been with a team that has had a young workhorse type of back, they haven't hesitated to use him, but at the same time, he was an offensive coordinator or play caller then, so it's hard to know exactly how he would move forward.
Awesome. Okay, so that's going to end our props. It's just
real quick.
Yeah.
Just want to get this out there.
Yeah,
you guys think Le'Veon Bell's played 16 games in a season one time? What do you put the odds that he does it this year?
What can we come up with a line?
I would put the line in his games played at like 13, probably.
Okay. I would probably put it
really tough. So for anyone it would speculate on this stuff, these are the ones in particular I would be very, very careful with. When you're only getting plus 300 and a guy can get hurt, it's very, very hard for it to come.
Yeah, plus 300 is not great odds.
Terrible.
I'm not putting. I mean, I agree with that, but I'm not. I don't. Like I said, I don't think games played doesn't have any correlation from one year to the next. So I would still put Bell's odds at like a normal 14, 15 games. So with every other
right.
Other
running back. Yeah. I think 14.5 is probably the line. But there is I think an added risk of missing games because of some sort of off the field issue with like drugs or whatever. That's a small thing, but that's an added risk.
And he just gets so much volume that, I mean, just on a per touch basis, obviously, every touch is increasing his injury risk, and he's probably the likely league leader in touches, or top 2. If not him, it's going to be DJ. But yeah,
that was going to be my argument. Is I don't think every running back's the same. You have to look at how many touches they're going to get. You hit the nail on the head there, Chris. I do think he's as elusive and as smart of a runner, so he's more likely. He's very cognizant of his health, and I think the narrative that everyone would point to against what we're saying is that, he missed training camp, that leads to injuries. There's a bunch of guys you can point to. The argument I'd have against that is that he has all the incentive in the world to get paid. So I imagine he's in really good shape. But, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure to analyze.
Cool. All right, let's move on to some of these awards. We have 4 major props to discuss. to end this pod. So we have 4 awards here. We're going to start with the Offensive Rookie of the Year. It's been an interesting one to try to predict of late. Dak Prescott won it last year over Ezekiel Elliott. I'm sure there's probably some thoughts on whether that was warranted. Todd Gurley, 2015. Odell in 2014. Eddie Lacy, RG3, Cam Newton going back a couple years. So definitely sort of all over the place in terms of which position is the most likely to win. And the odds are somewhat interesting as well. Leonard Fournette is the favorite at plus 400. Christian McCaffrey at plus 450. Sean Watson plus 500. So a lot of guys are sort of all over the place. Deshaun Kaiser, who is now going to start for the Browns at plus 1,000, is the second quarterback on the board. Raybon, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this prop? Definitely an interesting one.
Well, I think when I look at this prop, I kind of treat it almost like a fantasy draft, because what I'm really looking for is to win a Rookie of the Year, you're going to have to put up numbers. To put up numbers, you're going to need to be on the field. You're going to need volume. So the 2 guys I'd be looking at are Kareem Hunt and Dalvin Cook, because those 2 guys seem like, especially in Hunt's case, guys likely to get a lot of volume and be able to put up numbers on pace with some of the league's better players in year one. I think Hunt is the best value there at plus 1,200. And he's also the most likely. And then Cook is right there at plus 900, maybe a little more talented, but just some questions about, will he get goal line work? How much receiving work will he get? His numbers at the end of the year might not look as good as Hunt. So I'd go Hunt for both the most likely and the best odds.
Wow. I mean, if you think that he's the most likely at plus 1,200, that's just massive. 12 to 1, massive value. Freedman, hop in there.
I agree with everything he just said. For MVP, it's a mixture of production and win total for your team. But for an award like Offensive Rookie of the Year, it basically is just who was most productive on a team that maybe wasn't the worst in the league. And so looking at it from that perspective, absolutely, I agree. It's Kareem Hunt. And I think Raybon is maybe a little more bullish on Cook than I am, but I do understand it. I'm definitely not going with Fournette or McCaffrey. Kaiser is interesting, but and that's mainly just because we know he's starting out of the rookie quarterbacks. But yeah, I think Kareem Hunt is easily the front runner in this. And out of the receivers, I really don't see anybody being able to compete for it this year. Maybe Corey Davis, if he somehow has like an OBJ-esque type of explosion. But otherwise, I think it's one of the runners, and I think Kareem Hunt is clearly the front runner.
Wow, plus 1,200, Kareem Hunt. Pete, are you going to disagree here?
Nope, not disagreeing. I mean, if you just look at these best ball drafts, Kareem Hunt has turned into like a 3rd rounder, 4th rounder, and I don't mind it there. I think he's in the best position for opportunity. The one thing I will throw out there is the way that I see the NFL going is kind of, you can already see the Patriots leading kind of the trend here, picking up Burkhead. I'm really high on these like hybrid running back / receiver types. So everyone knows I'm bullish on Christian McCaffrey. I think he's the type of player that we're going to see really dominate the NFL in the future. I think these kind of hybrid players are going to be really successful. So I do like him, but at plus 450, relative to Kareem Hunt at plus 1,200, it's not close. I mean, I expect Kareem Hunt to have more fantasy points than him at this point. So that'd be my only other tidbit there. But, yeah, it's going to be an interesting rookie season. One guy who I think is going to be awesome out of this group who just won't have the opportunity is Patrick Mahomes. But at some point, if this is like the NBA and he didn't play and then could be a rookie next year and was a starter, I'd be going heavy on Mahomes. I think he has the opportunity to be real special in the NFL. He could bust, but I like him with Andy Reid and in this situation.
Wow. So the only category we have unanimous thoughts is this one with a plus 1,200 guy. So, all right, that's pretty cool. All right, let's move to Defensive Player of the Year. 4 of the last 5 years have been defensive ends, even though there's only been 2 different players. Khalil Mack won it last year, and then in 2015, 14, and 12, J.J. Watt won this award. Luke Kuechly was the guy that divided it up in 2013. One as a linebacker. If we look at the odds here, J.J. Watt returning, hopefully healthy for the season. He's at plus 350. Khalil Mack, last year's winner, was plus 500. Von Miller is right there at plus 500 as well. Freedman, I'll kick to you first on this one. What are your thoughts on this prop?
Well, first, I just want to say I feel completely unqualified to talk about this prop. Having said that, I'll talk about it. I think Watt, it's a little aggressive given his health issues for him to be the front runner. I understand it. When he's healthy, he's the best defensive player in the league. But I think at plus 350, that's aggressive. I'd rather go with Khalil Mack or Von Miller. If I'm going to take a shot on someone, I think I'd maybe – and a shot on someone who's maybe had some questionable health, I'd maybe go with Justin Houston. But I think Clowney, if we're going to look at someone in Houston who can maybe benefit from the return of Watt, but if Watt still isn't totally his dominant self, I think Clowney could be a guy, and he's 2,200 who could have some possibility there as Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good defensive players in the league now. We have some guys with some low odds that are really good defenders. Pete, what are your thoughts on this category?
Freedman just stole my point. I was gonna talk about Clowney. If Watt does play, I think plus 350 is way too much, but you can kind of get some of the benefit of Watt playing to go Clowney. Obviously, this is the perfect chance to go on brand and be a huge homer. I mean, Von Miller to me is the most unblockable player in the league, and I expect that to continue into this season. So I like Von Miller if I had to just pick one person outside the odds. Outside of that, it's tough to kind of find these guys. The secondary players don't get thrown at that much. Marcus Peters does make a lot of interceptions, but the best corners don't get as much opportunities they used to historically to make interceptions. So it's tough to go there. And then you're just looking at a lot of pass rushers that are kind of hard to distinguish between for me. So I don't have a ton of conviction on this one. I think Aaron Donald is one of the best, if not the best players on that side of the football, but this contract issue is a problem for this prop. So I'm struggling. Chris, do you have a strong take here or any conviction?
For most likely, I have a lot of conviction about Khalil Mack. For awards like this, I just try to go off what I see on the screen. And I mean, J.J. Watt, it was already his time. We've seen Von Miller do it, but right now, just nobody looks more ferocious to me as a pass rusher than Khalil Mack. He gets 2 games against Alex Smith, who's known to take sacks. He gets 2 games against the Broncos quarterbacks. So I think Mack is the front runner. Some other players, I think if I was just trying to bet some odds, I'd probably go against pass rushers or linebackers because they win so much. But when they don't, it's usually a safety that wins. Like a safety just comes along, like a Troy Polamalu has won one. When they just come along and they just make a ton of plays. And 2 guys I'd look at are Landon Collins at plus 2,200. I don't know what got into him last year, but he was just on a different level, always around the ball, always making tackles, forcing turnovers, things like that. Those things are tough to repeat, but he really stepped his game up to a ridiculous level, I thought, last year. And then another guy who's sitting here at with the best odds, with the best odds for us would be Eric Berry at plus 6,600. I mean, he's another guy he just makes crazy plays. I mean, I know he won a game I think last year with a 2-point conversion interception return or something like that against the Falcons. So I think if there's a down year for sacks where maybe we know that while pressures are consistent from year to year, sacks can sometimes have some variance. So, these guys like Watt and Clowney and Mack, they could get a lot of pressures, but perhaps not convert them into sacks. If that happens or if they get injured, that opens the door for just one of these playmaking safeties. So I'd probably go Berry as my best odds, but I wouldn't be surprised with Collins either.
Cool. I like it. All right, let's move on to NFL Coach of the Year. And if we look back, there's some historical data. Going back to 1990, the coach that has won has led a team that has won double-digit games. So that seems to be a pretty strong indicator that you want a guy who's going to coach a good team. That may not be a crazy thing to say. But it looks like, this award, the NBA award equivalent, it sort of seems to be like the coach that surprises the most. Like Bill Belichick is probably the best coach every year, but he hasn't won since 2010. Last year, Jason Garrett won. The year before, Ron Rivera with the Panthers when they surprised everyone. So it's sort of like the Greg Popovich thing, the best coach, but it's usually the surprising team. So I think there are some interesting odds here. Bill Belichick is the favorite, but I wonder how much he could surprise. So plus 700 might not be great odds. So it's probably going to be one of these teams that surprises. Pete, I know that you probably have some opinions on this. I know that in our last pod that you said that you like some up-and-coming teams. Maybe it could be one of those guys.
Oh man, I don't know what to think here. This is a really tough one for me. The homer in me wants to say Vance Joseph. I just think the Broncos division is really tough. I struggle with that. The other team that I'm bullish on coming into the season is the Titans. So Mike Mularkey is probably my favorite pick here. Teams I expect to be really good this year. I'm bullish on the Packers too, but their coaching situation with McCarthy, I just hate him. So I feel like I can't take him. But, yeah, not a ton of conviction, to be totally honest. I think this is a tough one in terms of what people's expectation is. The one thing I will say is I would not touch Belichick at plus 700. I think all the odds are just overinflated with the Patriots right now. Obviously, they're coming in as the big favorite. They play in an awful division. They should be good. But things happen, and really for him to win Coach of the Year, I'd expect the Patriots to have to go 15-1 or something like that. So that's where I'd be comfortable shorting him. Again, I feel comfortable shorting some of these ones, but I just don't feel great about it. When Mularkey is my favorite pick, but he has the sixth lowest odds, so I don't really feel great. I think a lot of people are kind of on to the Titans. Their team total has gone from 7.5 to 8.5 wins too, so a lot of that stuff's already baked in.
Yeah. Interesting. I figured Mularkey would be an interesting one, and maybe Cutter is an interesting one as well. Chris, what are your thoughts on some coaches that you like, just odds-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Pete that I think Mularkey's kind of the guy you want to target, but his odds aren't completely great. I will say that the Titans really, when you look at their schedule, the only games that I would really worry about are week 3 at home versus Seattle. And I mean, at least that's at home. Seattle does struggle on the road. And then they go to Pittsburgh in week 11, which is always tough. But aside from those 2 games, all their games are pretty winnable. Like if they went 14-2, I wouldn't say it would completely surprise me with as good as their offensive line is and their quarterback and their running game. It just really comes down to their defense and whatnot. But as far as odds, I think an interesting one is, and it's because it'll probably, he's kind of polarizing, is you have Marvin Lewis down there at plus 5,000. Now, one of the reasons I like him is because the Bengals underachieved last year, so they had a pretty bad record, so that gives him kind of some room to jump. And when you look at it, the Bengals, they are going to have some problems on the offensive line, but when you look at their schedule, they could easily win 10 games. I think they have 4 tough road games at Pittsburgh, at Green Bay, Minnesota, and one other one. But all their other 12 games are winnable. And Marvin Lewis also has one of the highest odds to be fired. So I think that actually helps with. I like that bet, betting on him a Coach of the Year, because that means I know he's polarizing. I know that a lot of people don't really expect him to do much. A lot of people are much more think he's much more likely to get fired than have a good season. So I think if the Bengals surprise and go 11-5 or something, I think you could see Marvin Lewis.
I wonder what the odds would be on one of those happening. You could just, he's either going to get fired or win Coach of the Year. But yeah, I mean, I think some of these odds are actually pretty interesting. Looking at back at last year, 10 teams won double digits, but a lot of those were the teams that always win double digits, in the Packers and the Seahawks and the Patriots. So again, it's a surprising team that wins double digits. So if you just look how many teams does that qualify for this year? Probably not that many, so at least narrows down the list a little bit for us. Freedman, you want to finish up on this prop for us?
Yeah, just kind of to reiterate what these guys have said, I totally agree that you have to fade the chalk here, because it's not really Coach of the Year. It's Coach of the Year who's in that Venn space of having a good record but doing more than people expected him to do, or doing something in circumstances that no one foresaw. So Bruce Arians winning Coach of the Year a few years ago when he was filling in as the interim coach for Chuck Pagano, something like that. And so I love the Marvin Lewis call, because this is a team, the Bengals, they're a perennial playoff team, right? We would expect to see some regression. It's not out of the realm of possibility to see them actually end up with a 12-4, even a 13-3 record as some things go their way. They could easily get some big wins within their division. Maybe they split with the Steelers. So I do like that call, because they're a team that should be regressing back to their playoff ways anyway, and his odds are just so low. So only I mean, he has the lowest odds, right? Like, he's tied with Jim Caldwell and Todd Boyles for the lowest odds, which just seems ridiculous. I mean, another one like Jim Caldwell is potentially there because people hate him. But the Lions, I don't know. I mean, they're not horrible. I prefer Marvin Lewis over Caldwell, and I think Caldwell gets a bad rap. But he's done pretty well with the Lions for 3 years for an organization that people really have no respect for. So, but yeah, I like the Marvin Lewis call.
Interesting. Yeah, 50-1. Pretty good odds, at least on that one. All right, last prop is the NFL MVP. If we just look at the past data on this award, 9 out of the last 10 years, it has been a quarterback. Last year, Matt Ryan won. Cam Newton the year before. Aaron Rodgers won his second. And then back in 2013, Peyton Manning got his fifth. So definitely it is a quarterback-skewed award. The last time that it was not a offensive player was actually in 1986. Lawrence Taylor, UNC guy, shout out, who's a linebacker for the Giants, obviously. He won. And then 1982, a kicker won. Freedman, this is right up your alley. You're the kicker whisperer. Unfortunately, no kickers actually have odds, so we can't bet on them. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting award for sure. Quarterbacks are usually the favorites. Wide receivers never really win this award, so there are some wide receivers that have odds, but definitely don't seem to be really good bets there. What are your thoughts, Freedman? I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aaron Rodgers is probably the chalky guy. And, I mean, obviously Brady, I think out of those two, the odds are pretty strong. But obviously you don't get any value by betting the top of the board there. I'm entirely fading running backs and wide receivers and defensive players just as, like a move that I think it's highly unlikely. And I don't think the odds are good enough for any of those players to justify taking them in comparison to like their probability of winning the award. So I think I'd probably, I think I'd probably go with, and again, I don't think any of these players provide great value, but I think Russell Wilson at 1,600 has a chance. And then also Derek Carr at 700. I think I prefer him to Rodgers and Brady given their odds, but I don't.
No way.
No, it's not that I think that he's going to win, but if I'm taking the odds into account, I'd rather take like a little bit of a discount with Carr, but I still don't like any of the value.
That's like me betting Tavon Austin every week right there. Carr over Aaron Rodgers.
Pete, what are your thoughts on this award? I will say that I did want to shout this out because that was funny. Blake Bortles, 10,000 plus 10,000. Joe Flacco plus 15,000. Does that say more about Joe Flacco than any other stat you've ever heard?
Yeah, I probably just locked up the win for Derek Carr so we can just play this back over and over and over again for next year for Freedman. But I think Aaron Rodgers is like a huge favorite relative to the rest of this group. Yeah. I understand the Tom Brady narrative. I think he's certainly obviously another big favorite, but in terms of who I had to pick, if I had to pick one guy regardless of odds, I'm taking Aaron Rodgers all day. And then the guys that we talked about already, I think are in the best position to do it are going to be guys like Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota. I like the odds you get with Mariota a little bit more. I think they have a great chance to be a playoff team and really push within that division. And I think Jameis Winston's another guy. I could easily see Tampa Bay winning it this year. We need to see more on the defensive end, but I think Jameis could have a huge fantasy season. So that's where I'd look. Chris, what do you think on this? Am I stupid to say Derek Carr is a really bad pick, or are you with Freedman on that one?
He's a bad pick.
The tough thing about Carr, so the one thing I'm worried about with Carr is I think that they got Marshawn Lynch because they wanted to run more in the red zone, and that just combined with all this Cooper red zone shenanigans, it just makes me question, like, does he have that 40 touchdown upside? But I like Carr. I think Carr is one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and I think he has a good chance. I think those odds are a little too close to Rodgers for my liking. When I'm looking back at the MVP winners, as Bryan said, 9 out of the last 10 have been quarterbacks. When a quarterback doesn't win, it's usually a running back. So the first place I'm looking is I'll take David Johnson at plus 3,300 because he gets enough volume that he could just put up a ridiculous season, and he's plus 3,300. Well, Le'Veon Bell is plus 1,600. So I think there's some value there where six of the top six running backs have won since 2000. So we don't know if that's variance over the last 10 years or it's just a sign of the NFL going to a more pass-heavy league. But either way, Johnson could catch 100 balls. I mean, for all we know. So I like those odds. And then I think when the top quarterbacks like an Aaron Rodgers doesn't win, which I think he is the favorite. He's won twice in the last 6 years, only player to do that. But when a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers doesn't win, it's usually somebody that has always been kind of above average, but maybe has that outlier season. Last year it was Matt Ryan. The year before it was Cam Newton. So just looking at these odds, I think Phillip Rivers at plus 5,000 is a guy where, as I said, 5,300 yard pace with Keenan Allen in the lineup. He has Keenan Allen. He has Tyrell Williams. He has Travis Benjamin to pad his total with some deep balls. Dontrell Inman has to be one of the best fourth or fifth receivers in the league. Then you have Gates, who can catch 10 touchdowns. Henry, who can catch 10 touchdowns. You can throw it to Melvin Gordon. Just a lot of avenues for Phillip Rivers to just put up huge numbers. And if the Chargers, because the Chargers do have a pretty solid defense. So if the Chargers can kind of play just enough defense to win 10, 11 games somehow, and Phillip Rivers has one of those 5,000-yard seasons with 35-plus passing touchdowns, I think he's a really good bet. Drew Brees is tempting at plus 2,500, especially when you compare that to Brady at plus 400 and Rodgers at plus 500. But as you guys have all mentioned, I think that his attempts are going to go down, and I just don't have enough confidence that with that defense that they're going to win enough games to put Brees in consideration to win that award.
Cool. All right. Well, we're out of props, and we only have just a minute left here. So we're going to just go a quick lightning round because I know that some of you guys have some interesting props that whether they're like player season props, a specific guy to go over, under yards or touchdowns, or some fun ones, ones that we had thrown out pre-pod, and I think mentioned briefly here. First coach to be fired, Adam Gase is the favorite at plus 2,000. There's a prop, any tied game in the NFL season. The favorite is yes at minus 350. There's a site that has like an entire section devoted to Adrian Peterson versus Marshawn Lynch props. But lightning round. Someone start us off, hop in there. Any other props on just the betting market that have really stood out to you as fun or inefficient?
Yeah, I got one. Marcus Mariota, does he have a red zone interception this year? Which the fact that this prop even exists, I think is both like amazing and ridiculous. It's negative 160 that he throws an interception, plus 130 that he doesn't. I think he's going to throw much more in the red zone this year than he has previously with the addition of the offensive receiving weapons there. I think the odds that any quarterback will throw a red zone interception are pretty good. So I think I would say yes on this one, but more than the fact that like I would bet or not bet on this, just the fact that this exists as a prop is pretty amazing.
Yeah, the prop market is fun. Lightning round. Someone else jump in there.
With Sean McCoy, over under 9.5 touchdowns. He had 14 last year. This is rushing touchdowns. Over under 9.5 rushing touchdowns. He had 14 last year, but the 2 years before that he had 5 and 3. And this offense is sinking. They traded away Sammy Watkins, so I would easily bet that under.
Cool. Lightning round. Keep on going.
I want to bet. It's my own prop, but I want to bet Amari Cooper as the number one fantasy scorer this year. Anyone? I don't know how you'd set that up or what. I'll let you guys take. Let me come up with something here. I'll let you guys take anyone other than Brown, Evans, Beckham, and Julio. You can take anyone else.
You just took like all of the people who were likely to beat Amari.
You still have so many. You have Jordy Nelson, Dez Bryant, Michael Thomas, Doug Baldwin, Brandon Cooks.
I will easily take Jordy over Cooper.
Okay, there we go.
I like it. This tied game one is interesting to me because of this rule change that I'm not sure if people know about. So the NFL changed their rule in overtime. They're shortening it from 15 minutes to 10 minutes for the preseason and regular season games. It's going to be, I still believe, 15 minutes in the playoffs. But yeah, that does make ties more likely, even though the ties aren't super likely in the first place. But I guess that's why there's that juice on the yes. What any strong opinions on that? That seems to be like a heavy vig on the yes, but 10 minutes is not that long, honestly.
Yeah, I think there will be a tied game this year.
Yeah,
there are most years.
Yeah,
I think there will be. Yeah.
One more I found interesting: Tyrod Taylor passing touchdowns. -140 on the under. 20 is the line there. Plus 100, plus 110 on the over. I'm easily taking the under. I don't think he's going to get enough opportunity there to get to 20 touchdowns passing.
Cool. Any last props? Last chance?
No, but definitely one more shout out to Chris with the DFS MVP pod. We got it in early, but I wanted to shout that out. I listened every single week last year, and it was awesome.
Really appreciate it, Peter.
Yeah, definitely check that out. You can follow Chris at Chris Raybon on Twitter. You guys are doing is it once a week this year for your pod?
Yes, sir. We're actually going to do positional strategy pods. Trying to do 4 of them and release them sometime between now and the start of the season. So it might be coming out every other day, but in the season, once a week.
Gotcha. Yeah, and you guys have already had some good thoughts on like quarterbacks and really all the positions at this point for week 1. So definitely go check those out. Chris, thanks for joining us, man.
No doubt, man. Thanks for having me. It was a really interesting conversation, man.
Yeah, definitely fun. All right. Thank you guys for listening. It's the last week before NFL. So next week we're rolling. We'll be back with our regular Flex podcast where we're going to go over week 1 and then we'll probably talk some betting markets as well. So definitely check us out next week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.